Hey guys, welcome back to Star Wars Timeline. My name is Ben. Today, I am very glad to present a very special guest, Jason Fry. I'm pretty sure he doesn't need any introduction. He wrote for Star Wars reference book, he wrote short story for Star Wars Insider Magazine, and he also wrote some of my personal favorite canon Star Wars novels. I first got introduced to your work, Mr. Jason, through Weapons of the Jedi and Moving Target, which you co-wrote with Cecil Castellucci. Those are Luke and Leia novels, for those of you guys who don't know, which were released in 2015, prior to the release of The Force Awakens. Jason, it is so good to have you. Thanks for your time. Please tell us, how are you doing? What's the latest from Mr. Jason?
I am doing great, and thank you for that very kind introduction. And I'm very, very happy to be here and talk some Star Wars with two books that are very dear to my heart.
How does it feel knowing you wrote two of the biggest heroes Star Wars has to offer? Obviously, Star Wars doesn't need no introduction, the biggest film franchise in the world, and those two stories are behind you. How does it feel? Like, what's the feeling?
Yeah, I like to say that writing for Star Wars is something where you pinch yourself every day that you get to do it. I mean, it really is an honor and a privilege. And I have loved these characters since I was 8 years old. So there's a powerful incentive and sense of responsibility to get them right, to write the kind of stories that I would have wanted to read as a kid and now as a grown-up Star Wars fan. And I know many of the Star Wars authors, and there isn't a single person among them who doesn't feel the same way, which I think is something really wonderful about the Star Wars novels and stories in general, whether they're comics, video games, what have you. I mean, every author, I think, has that sense of responsibility and wanting to do right by characters in a setting that we all love.
And I think what's fascinating is that all the authors and the fans never seem to converge on one unanimous feeling, right? We all human beings, we all have different tastes, different things that we gravitate towards. And I think it only makes Star Wars richer when all of us come together and share in on it, right? There might be certain books that you'll enjoy more. There might be certain shows that you like more. And because we're all so different, it's Star Wars is larger than ever. I think it's safe to say, especially with Disney Plus. So we have all of that, wonderful adult and kids candy shop to play around with. I'm pretty sure the pressure was very high, for honoring George Lucas' creation. How did you find that personal calm inside of the storm and say, all right, I got the gig, I'm doing this. How do we move forward with this?
The biggest challenge was for Weapon of a Jedi. That was interesting because, like you say, people have favorite characters. And growing up as a young Star Wars fan, I was always very much a Han guy. Han was the character I wanted to hear stories about. And I didn't quite get Luke. I thought Luke should have run off with Han and been a space pirate at the end of A New Hope. That sounded a lot more fun than, being a soldier and taking orders and all that stuff. So at the beginning of Weapon of a Jedi, that was really interesting because I was like, okay, I would have thought of myself as the better choice to write the Han book, but I'm writing the Luke book, so I've got to get this right. There's a funny story about that I'll tell you in a minute. But so what did I do about that? I kind of took myself to Luke boot camp, and that started with, this is a story set right after A New Hope. This is not yet Luke Skywalker, Jedi Knight, etc. This is Luke still finding his way. He's never met Yoda. He's only had a little bit of training from Ben. So, it's a very different place for the character than some parts of that identity. Yeah. And so I went back to A New Hope, to the making of it, and reading everything that George had written about the character and, what Mark Hamill had also said about finding the character as an actor. I thought that was, the right place to be. And as well as, looking at everything from, coverage of Star Wars to also fan sites. And there were two things that really helped me with that character a lot. One was there's an account, it's in J.W. Rinsler's wonderful, back here behind me on the shelf, account of The Making of Star Wars, which is a terrific book that everyone should read. But Rinsler talks about early on Hamill is shooting the scene after he and C-3PO find R2-D2.
Mm-hmm.
And C-3PO is all up in arms, and so Luke played that scene kind of angrily too, and Lucas says, "Cut," and he goes, "It's not a big deal. Just play it. Play it understated, etc."
Mm-hmm.
And Hamill didn't agree, and so he deliberately did like the smallest take on it possible, and it's all right. And expecting Lucas to be like, "All right, that doesn't work," and then meet him in the middle. And
Mm-hmm.
Lucas goes, "Perfect." And Hamill's like, "Oh, okay." And that's the take you see in the movie. Very, very not a big deal. And there's a terrific fan on the Force.net lit boards who was talking about Luke as an action hero, and said that the thing about Luke is that he's gentle. He's really not a big confrontational rush-off action hero.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about that, that's true. Think about, the way he wins in Return of the Jedi is by throwing his lightsaber away and, reaching out to his father, not by fighting. And the only time we see him as the kind of conventional action hero is in Empire.
Mm-hmm.
He basically tells Yoda to pound sand and runs off to go rescue his friends and go fight Darth Vader, etc. And he gets his butt kicked, and he really gets his world destroyed. He learns a secret he's not ready for, etc. So the one time Luke is that kind of conventional action hero, all goes really terribly. And so I put those together, and that was really, really interesting. And then I felt like I had the grounding of the character. And the other big piece of that in writing that book was the Force almost being like a character in its own regard. And so I went through and read a lot, thought a lot about the Force, and how Jedi access it, how they feel it, how they experience it, what the breakthroughs might have been. And I mean, that was really good training for Weapon of a Jedi, but also a couple years later for the Last Jedi novelization. Mm-hmm. Like, for me, the two go absolutely hand in hand. Like, I couldn't have written Last Jedi novelization without what I learned for Weapon of a Jedi.
Yeah, I think it's a great mention, because I'm one of those 80s fans who, I grew up in Russia watching them on VHS tapes. And when I came here, it's, there gives and takes. There some things I enjoy more than others with new, Disney, Star Wars. But the Last Jedi movie completely hit home with me. I loved that version of Luke, which to me personally, and I understand why people have issues with it, it's totally legitimate. We all can have differences of opinion. But I felt it was just a smooth and seamless transition of who he was and who he has become. And also, Jason, I'm a huge fan of short form writing, Franz Kafka, mm-hmm. Robert E. Howard, Edgar Allan Poe, but I also enjoy young reader books. I'm a huge fan of Kevin J. Anderson's Young Jedi Knight series. I even made like a small petition, and he approved it. Hey guys, Disney, could we please have these reissued? We love them so much. But it all comes back to my question is, what is the difference between writing a short story versus writing a junior novel for younger kids, which is obviously is a smaller version of a novel than for adults?
It's kind of plot mechanics and character arcs, really related to how much space, how much time you have. I don't think there's all that much difference, honestly, between a YA or a middle grade book and an adult book. At least not in sense of language. Like for me, the writing is essentially the same. It's more, sometimes you have kid protagonists or things like that, and the word count is a little shorter. But I mean, to me, those feel like variations on the same form. But with a short story, you're not going to have room for as many elements of the story, as many character arcs. So you're kind of paring things back and looking at a couple of essentials, to bring those home in whatever you have, whether it's, say, 5,000 words, 10,000 words, or even less than that. I've written a number of very short stories back in the day for the Star Wars Insider, and those are particularly difficult. That form, it's a nice challenge. I always enjoyed doing them, but it's really punishing as an author. Like, basically everything extraneous has to go away. You've got basically kind of, a point, a reversal, a single piece of an arc, and anything, any filigree, etc., you're just not going to have room for. So that was an interesting form. But those are almost kind of micro stories, not short stories.
Yeah, when I first came to US, so I was 14, and then I have made this great granted discovery of learning that Conan the Barbarian is not just portrayed by Arnold Schwarzenegger. He's actually invented in the 30s, but one of the biggest American writers. And once you have that rude awakening, it's like, he's not a pulpy character. This is real literature.
Yeah.
And it just blew my mind how within the scope was just one paragraph, Robert E. Howard's literally puts you in his world. It's such a master craft, which doesn't allow any room for failure or faking it or being disingenuous. I love that form. But also what I wanted to bring forth is that I know that a lot of fans sort of underappreciate or just are not very invested in source book materials. I myself, I'll be frank, I mostly read novels, but I do have one or two source books. And I wanted to ask you, there's also sort of a narrative component to that as well, right? You're not just like putting straight data and the pictures against it. You're still sort of, in a way, telling a story in the Star Wars universe.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing that was interesting to me is I do firmly believe that, yes, by all means, source books should be entertaining to read. If they don't do that, they've failed their job. And I'm also a firm believer with a lot of them. And you see this in, say, DK's wonderful visual guides or Inside the Worlds. You should be able to kind of dip in and out. They're not really always meant to be read cover to cover, but if you want to take 15 minutes and read a couple of spreads, you should have a really good time. I am a firm believer, though, that the job of source books is to support the wider storytelling. They're to deepen your love of the movie or a book series. And also to kind of plant seeds for future storytelling, et cetera, and not block things off. And, I've written a lot of what I call Star Wars lore. And I eventually reached a point, it was around the book Essential Guide to Warfare, where I was kind of filling that book with little vignettes and little kind of mini stories and stuff like that. And I eventually realized that what I was doing was I really wanted to tell fiction stories. And I really was trying to scratch that itch, but I was actually, my poor editor, I was actually sort of leaving behind the mission of the actual source book and going to a different one. And so I had to be like, okay, don't do that. Let's rein that in. And by all means, you're auditioning pretty well to get to write fiction, but let's remember what this book is really about and what it's supposed to be doing.
From your perspective as an author, as a writer specifically, which media do you think has the strongest writing? Animation, film, Star Wars television shows, comics? What's your personal favorite?
Well, that's a good question. I'm a lover of story above all else. And the world is full of books that are beautifully written, but the story doesn't work. I would much rather read a book where maybe the writing isn't something where I'll highlight particularly wonderful passages, et cetera, and have kind of writerly admiration for it. I'd much rather have a really great breakneck story that won't let me go. So I don't really think about it that way. For me, it's if the story works, I'm there in whatever medium, and and if it doesn't, there we are. But the wonderful thing about where we are in Star Wars, and you alluded to it earlier, is we're in such a golden age of Star Wars, whether it's novels, comics, video games. Now, my goodness, there's the new Star Wars TV shows multiple times a year. If you'd given me a preview of that world as a little kid who was Star Wars mad, I would have been just astonished that the world could ever be so awesome. Yeah. And I don't think that was wrong. So the great thing about it is, these days, if a Star Wars story doesn't work for you, it's really not that big a deal. There's going to be something else that's going to float your boat, and really soon. And I think that's terrific, and it makes me super happy. But I do think some of us who have been fans for a very long time and super invested in everything are still kind of getting used to that. Like, you've got to be able to be like, this story, its intended audience is a little different than me, and that's okay. That's okay, even if it's Star Wars, it's a little different for me. And at the same time, we've got to get used to the idea of, well, that one didn't really work for me. That's okay. Well, there's going to be something else in a couple weeks or a couple months, and hopefully I'll like that better.
Yeah. You know, when Star Wars Rebels hit in 2014 as a first kind of like preview of what's to come with the new era of Star Wars, a lot of folks don't remember this is even before The Force Awakens. This is the first new Star Wars that we got. I gotta tell you, from the first episode till the last, it blew my freaking mind because I sort of now understand a little bit closer as I learn about you, Jason Fry, the person, that why I liked your story so much is that for me, when I discuss cinema with my friends or my younger brother, story is always immediate. All the lightsabers, all the flashes, all the spaceships, that's secondary things. I mean, the visuals of it, your film language, I want a good story. That's the pillar that supports everything else. And Rebels was just such a beautiful portrayal of a hero's arc that doesn't draw on the Skywalker legacy. It doesn't tread the past. It doesn't look over the shoulder. All new cast, so bold, so fresh. It just blew my mind. I really, really enjoyed it. Jason, I wanted to ask a couple of questions on the writing in general, and then we jump into the books if you don't mind.
Sure.
So when I studied traditional animation here in New York City in the School of Visual Arts, you might have heard of it, quite a popular school. And some of my storyboarding teachers and script writing teachers were saying that, you know, being an artist isn't a job, it's a lifestyle. And would you say the same is true for a writer? Like, it's just a state of mind for you?
There's a sensibility you definitely have to bring to it, that's always with you, whether, you know, I like to say I read or watch everything with a kind of a mental red pen in hand. I can't help it. I mean, it's my job to take apart stories and how they work, or sometimes as how they don't work. But it is very much a job. I think, you know, there's no shortage of writers who don't write anything because they get so tangled up in the process that they get paralyzed and they can't do anything. And so, yeah, I mean, you know, particularly, you know, as a Star Wars writer, you know, I'm not as active as I was a few years ago, but there were years I had 7, 8, 9, 10 projects a year. And I mean, that is very much a job. I mean, you have to move fast and be accurate and deal with edits and everything else. And it's a rapid fire pace. And, you know, if you're going off kind of maundering about art in your head, you're not going to get there because you don't have that kind of time. But, you know, that said, it has never, ever been just a job to me. And the day it ever is the day I'll find something else to write. It's always a privilege and something I feel immensely lucky to get to do. So it's super hard work sometimes, but it's the kind of work, you know, you really want to do. And I mean, I guess more than anything else, that would be my sensibility as a writer for finding jobs. You know, find a job, whether it's a story of your own creation or, you know, something you've hired on to do in somebody else's universe. You know, you're going to work super hard and you're going to work every day, but, you know, make sure it's something that you love doing because it will come through in the work. And if you don't love if you're kind of enduring it, the reader's going to see that too.
It took me a very long time to grasp the concept as I was studying art that what is the artist's signature? Like, what do people mean? What is this style? Like, just to conceptualize it. But when I was reading your books, like the love and joy for these characters just emerges. Again, it's something you can't fake, especially if you read a lot. Guys, not hyping myself up a lot, but I do enjoy reading a lot. Science fiction, you know, fantasy, you know, Dragonlance, Warhammer, you know, 40K, all of that wonderful stuff. It's like, and when you like, it pops off the page. It doesn't have to be fancy language. Something. It's just love for these characters, and that's what I felt, and that's why I'm having such a kick talking about, you know, the books that you wrote that I'm personally such a huge fan of. I reviewed them like back in the day when I just started my channel. Like, oh, these are some of the first books I want to review. Jason, I would assume that you as a professional author, at least to me personally, are the authority on writing because you're the guy who gets hired to do the job. From your angle, is there such thing as objectivity? Is there an objectively strong, powerful story? Or is it all subjective like people say, you know, all art is subjective?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I certainly think there are stories that work or don't work. You know, does the is the character's arc stay believable? I mean, in a character's arc, they're going to wind up as a very different person than when they started. That's what an arc is. So you're going to have a journey along the way, and there's going to be reversals and surprises and sometimes shocks. But we've all experienced stories where, at a critical point, the character does something we just don't believe they would do. That's an example of a story that, to me, I think pretty objectively stops working. Does the story blow its major themes? If it's part of an ongoing story, do the themes not fit what you come to expect from that universe? We could, it'd be a whole different video discussion. But if you look at, say, the end of Game of Thrones, I mean, that's what people are responding to there. That character arc at the end, and the way and whether or not it fit with the themes that had come before, rubbed a lot of people wrong. That's interesting.
Oh yeah.
There was certainly enough of that I think you can say that, something didn't work in that story. And, it's perfectly fine. We see this in Last Jedi actually a lot. I mean, that was obviously a pretty challenging story for some of the audience. And the argument, which is a perfectly legitimate argument, is, is that story internally consistent? Do you believe the characters throughout it? Do you believe it fits with themes of the larger universe? And, there's some really interesting fights about Last Jedi in that. I have my opinion. I think it fits very well for various reasons, but I understand how people wind up somewhere else. But, those are the stories I think you learn the most about. I mean, I happen to think that one works, but where there are differences of opinion, that's really interesting. I'm a huge Peter Jackson fan. I think the Lord of the Rings movies are pretty close to perfect. I find myself watching the Hobbit movies a surprising number of times, and I think those movies are really not perfect. But they're in this really interesting space where they don't work, but it feels like they almost worked. And I find myself kind of obsessively watching them over and over again, trying as a storyteller to put that together. Like, where do I think this is breaking down? Because it feels really close to working, and that's simultaneously frustrating, but you learn a ton from that. That's advice I tell aspiring writers all the time, is go out and, you don't have to do it publicly, just do it with friends or do it by yourself. Go out and kind of critique stories, the ones that work for you, but also the ones that don't. And try to understand what are you responding to? How are you responding? And why is that? But the ones that are really close, those are the ones where you're really going to learn.
Yeah. With Hobbit movies, it's funny that you bring them up. And now we have, the Rings of Power, which people have 25 gazillion different opinions about, obviously. Because
I'm only 2 episodes in on that, so
I'm also only 2 episodes in with my younger brother. I'm just waiting on him. I'm like, come on, dude, because we like to watch things together. He's busy. But with Hobbit movies, if I were to summarize them in one word, I would agree with you. They're not on the same kind of like cinematic level there, but they were, in one word, fun. There's just something fun about them, like being in that world. And you're right, maybe all these, shifts and gears, all the pulleys and levers are not working perfectly, but something there is just fun. And you're right, the Lord of the Rings is just the trilogy. If the Star Wars, the original saga, was the stuff in the 80s, then the 90s and 2000s were defined by the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Guys, we are moving to the hot stuff now. Star Wars, the weapons of the Jedi, Star Wars, the moving target, but also the novel, which we're not going to talk about here. You want to focus on your work, but also the Smuggler's Run. Those were 3 books that were released in 2015, each one focusing on a separate hero. Now, was that also always the plan between you guys? Like, you knew that you're writing a character per, author, or joint effort?
It was assigned, and actually, this will bring us back to that funny story I promised to tell you. So I was at New York Comic Con talking about these books, and next to me was Greg Rucka, who wrote Smuggler's Run, the Han book. And I told the story I just told you about how growing up I'd always been a Han guy, and it was kind of a struggle for me to write a Luke story at first. But I wound up writing a Luke story I was very proud of, and so I felt very happy that I'd gone to Luke boot camp and came to understand the character better. And Greg Rucka's kind of looking over me. We were literally sharing a microphone, and he's looking over me with this kind of curious expression, and he goes, and Greg has this wonderful gravelly voice. He goes, "That's funny, because I was always a Luke guy growing up, and getting to write Han, that was something."
You switched roles.
And the guy moderating the panel was Mike Siglain, the creative, I don't know his exact title, but the guy who runs all of publishing at Lucasfilm, who had assigned it to us. And he's looking at and Mike's looking over at us in bafflement. And he finally leans over and he's like, why didn't either of you two idiots tell me?
That's awesome.
I don't know how Greg feels, but I'm really glad I didn't. I was too scared to. I wasn't going to say, like, could I switch to the other book? And because I thought the answer would be no. You can write no books. We'll find somebody who's more cooperative. But I wound up being really grateful about the switcheroo. But it was hilarious to me that Greg Rucka had felt the same way. But it all turned out well.
Yeah, I think a challenge only elevates an author. When I talk video games with my friends, you look, for example, at 16-bit era, the Super Nintendos, and all the Japanese art that, those role-playing games, produced at Final Fantasies with Nobuo Uematsu and, Hironobu Sakugachi, all of these guys. It's art. 16-bit kind of like art style came back, and people recognize it for what it is. It is art. Limitations create strength in, body of work. And Jason, I'm telling you, it's again, guys, we're not doing this for show. It's just two, a professional author and his fan talking about the book that I honestly, genuinely loved. What really, really impressed me about The Weapons of the Jedi, it's Luke's journey of self-discovery continues. There is this beautiful Force mysticism without deconstructing, dismantling it, and keeping it mysterious, but pushing on with it and telling us more about it. It's about this Luke's calling to a forbidden old temple with his new sort of adversary, and you're still using these classical heroic motifs. And but the entire novel obviously stands alone from A New Hope, because obviously it takes place after, and it is a continuation, so it definitely has new elements. How do you begin to brainstorm for this kind of a story? When do you know you have a story on your hands?
Well, I had, on that one in particular, I had a lot of help. The outline of that story was already in mind at Lucasfilm, where every project is a little different, and sometimes, like the Servants of the Empire quartet, for instance, there was a lot of space to define the story myself. But for the outlines of that were always pretty plain. Like Luke winds up exploring a jungle world looking for a lost Jedi temple, meets this antagonist and has his first lightsaber battle. Like, that was the story. And it was actually pretty funny, because when I was given that outline, I kind of started laughing. And poor Mike Siglain, again, I put him through the ringer in that book. He was like a little puzzled, like, why was I reacting that way? But my explanation was, when I started collecting Star Wars figures in 1978, when the original 12 from Kenner came out, and I was a little kid. I was 9 years old. I didn't have any money, and so for the first thing I could do, I could buy 2 action figures, which was a tough decision. I didn't know quite what to do. I mean, do you buy you buy Luke and Vader, but then that doesn't work. Like, Luke and Vader having
I feel the struggle.
Saber fights all the time. Like, what are you gonna do? So I decided I bought C-3PO and R2-D2, because in the original Star Wars, that's who you see first, is kind of them on their own little adventure. And then when I saved enough allowance to have a third figure, I bought Luke. And then I had to save my allowance for a long time. So it was a long time before I had stormtroopers or any antagonists. I just had Luke and the 2 droids. And so when Mike told me the outlines of the story, I started laughing. And the reason was, because I had spent months in the summer of 1978 with those three action figures exploring like couch cushions and Lego, looking for like Jedi temples and stuff, because I didn't have any other action figures. So I was like, yeah, I will absolutely tell this story. I told it like 50 times to myself in the summer of 78. So that was just a wonderful preparation for it, literally going back to my own childhood and,
Mm-hmm.
stories I had wanted to tell, and that I actually got to do so. Beyond then, like layering in the elements, I mean, the Force was a really critical one. And then the other stuff was really, that book was right after the switchover from the expanded universe. And so I really wanted to honor some elements from that. So things like, you have Luke flying the two-seater Y-Wing, which is the same one we see him fly in the holiday special, down to even the mechanics of the lightsaber duel. Like there are pieces of that are borrowed from the expanded universe fight he has with Baron Taj in the old Marvel comics, even down to some of the motion, some of the choreography of the fight.
I didn't know that.
Are the same. Oh yeah, are the same as in that story, because I wanted to honor it. The idea that Luke is blinded and has to rely on the Force to stay alive. That's a direct take from Marvel 33, way back when. Similarly, Sarko Plank, his antagonist, winds up falling in a pit, which is an homage to Splinter of the Mind's Eye. That's what happens to Vader.
I was going to bring that book up.
Sarko Blank in Weapon of a Jedi takes the same number of tottering steps wounded in the same direction that Darth Vader does on Mimban before falling in a hole. Not an accident, because I really wanted to honor those stories because they had meant so much to me. And even though we were telling a very different story about Luke's first saber duel, I wanted fans who loved those stories to feel the echoes of them. So, that was fun. And, I think people who hadn't read those stories, didn't need to know any of that. They could enjoy Weapon of a Jedi on their own. But for fans who did, there was a little extra, depth to it, I hope.
Yeah. I was definitely getting the vibes from the Splinter of the Mind's Eye, which I had read quite late in my Star Wars Legends journey. I started reading in the late 90s, but that book, I sort of got into it much, much later. But yeah, I saw some parallels, just the feelings, the scene setups. There were a lot of familiarities. I'm like, I'm flipping to the page and I'm getting those notes. But guys, you heard it here firsthand. And I knew it in my heart of hearts, but I also know a lot of authors working in Star Wars today, man, they're just the biggest fans of Star Wars Legends as all of us. They know where it all came from and they're carving a new path. And I'm personally one of the fans who always was excited about a new chapter in Star Wars literature. And I elevated always, guys, here's your legends, here's your canon. They all work together. They don't have to coincide in terms of narratively. You can enjoy both. But so you had the general structure, general assignment, so to speak. But the voice of the story is still yours. Keeping in mind that this would be for younger generation of readers, what was the most important message you wanted to give out in this book?
I wouldn't say message so much, but I knew pretty quickly what the feel of the book was. It was a very quiet book, and it's almost borrowed from a fairy tale. I mean, it's into the woods. I mean, Luke finds a guide. It turns out he picks the wrong guide, but he finds a guide and he heads off into the woods. And, what happens with his training, it's all kind of quiet, small scale storytelling, which, just felt right for the story in terms of where Luke is. This is not his learning to master the Force. That comes later. That's a different story. It's him taking a first step in learning something that will stand him in good stead later, even though he has a whole lot to learn. And the quiet part was also just his understanding the Force and, the idea that you don't command it, you let it guide you. It's, once again, Luke being gentle. It's letting go. It's trusting the Force and letting it guide you instead of trying to push it around in various ways. So, that became pretty clear to me that this was a quiet book and kind of a small scale book. And then, my job had to be to have faith in that and write it that way and not doubt that if that was what was right for the story, that was the way to go. And, It's funny. I've read a lot of reviews of Weapon of a Jedi, and that's one that comes up periodically.
Hmm.
I wanted a lot of blood and thunder, etc., and I didn't get it. Not very much happens in this book, and my reaction to it is always kind of, yeah, that's kind of true, but that's okay. I'm sorry it wasn't the book for you, and I'm sure there are many other Star Wars books that work, but that's an important part of being a writer too, is finding that feel, whether it's a message or a theme or whatever it is, and then working with your editor and other people to make sure that that's right for the project. But then once it is, just having confidence in that and letting the story be the story. Isaac Dinesen, the great writer, Karen Blixen, said it best. She said, "Be loyal to the story. Be unswervingly loyal to the story." And
Hmm.
that's really what you got to do.
Yeah, I would actually counter anyone who would say this book is about nothing. I know a couple of my fellow YouTuber friends whose opinions I do value that didn't find that book very endearing. And once again, it's fine. It's no chip off your shoulder. It's just personally a person doesn't find this work good. Big deal. It is what it is. We got to respect other people's perspectives. But it's, for me personally, it was so. And it's funny that you brought up the word folk tale, because as an Eastern European person, there's a lot of versed in European culture, Hans Christian Andersen and Brothers Grimm and all these European folk tales. Those elements immediately sip into your pores, and the content of the story is rich, not in terms of the volumes of the words or how many ships or lightsaber opponents he takes down, is just what surrounds him and what happens to him. It is so full of, so you just got to get into it and see it. Maybe it's just because my personality type that I find these things. Maybe I'm the one who's digging in and assigning meaning to where perhaps the original author didn't intend. But that's certainly the idea I got from the book. I journeyed there with Luke Skywalker, specifically recognizing the moment before he starts mentoring with this old white sage Yoda, and he's finding his footing. He's just like this little rabbit in the forest, like, what do I do? What happens next? I sort of, that's what I got from the book, and I really, really enjoyed it. And Jason, I'm always fascinated when authors are working with staple characters that are known to people globally around the world. I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, should the author respect and preserve the actors, but also director's vision for this character, or should you follow your own gut instinct?
That's a tricky balance. I mean, obviously, George Lucas invented Luke, and I mean, it's right there in the names. There's an enormous amount of George Lucas in Luke. So if you want to understand that character, your starting point has to be respect for what George Lucas intended, etc. From there. But as to where where that character goes, that's really the kind of thing you're going to work out with your editor and other people. Like, if this is an adventure of Luke, whatever it is, there's got to be some unexpected stuff, some reversals, etc., or you don't have a compelling story. But is what's going to happen to Luke, does it fit the character? If you are giving the character unforeseen challenges, and this essentially, we could be talking about the sequel trilogy here, do they work for that character? Can you see that happening? And that's where some interesting things happen. I mean, a lot of people's issue with the sequel trilogy is about Luke's characterization, which is not the kind of thing I'm going to say is right or wrong. I mean, that's people's opinion. But
Mm-hmm.
The idea for where we find Luke in the sequel trilogy, et cetera, is essentially in George Lucas's treatments too. He had him as kind of a Colonel Kurtz figure who's gone off and disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
So that doesn't necessarily mean that was the right take on the character, but the creator of the character himself had that in mind. The thing about actors is a little trickier, and I've gotten myself in trouble on that occasionally out on social media, but it's not something I back down about. I mean, it's certainly, you certainly want to listen to actors about their characters, because it's an essential part of their craft, obviously, is finding that character and bringing it to life and bringing some of themselves into it. I mean, every good actor does that.
Right.
At the same time, I don't believe that actors are always the best judges of what should happen to their character story wise. Sometimes, um, sometimes, particularly in middle chapters of trilogies, the whole point is that characters are moving backward. They're getting challenged. They're finding out certain things aren't true. They're trying to find a different path, etc. Where there's a tendency sometimes for actors, they want the big hero scene. They want to be front and center, etc. And sometimes that's not the best place for a character in a given story. So I always listen to actors, but I'm a little wary of I'm a little wary of giving them the final word and all that, because I just don't think that's how storytelling works. And that's not a new thing in Star Wars. I mean, the point has been distorted in ways that are sort of dishonest, but it's well known that Mark Hamill and Rian Johnson had an enormous amount of back and forth about Luke in Last Jedi. And Hamill eventually came around to what Ryan had in mind for the character. But after after not seeing it at first and really being kind of resistant, which is fine, that's part of the process. Similarly, all the way back in A New Hope, Alec Guinness almost walked off Star Wars because George changed his mind and decided that Obi-Wan Kenobi was going to die fighting Vader. And, what Lucas explained to Guinness, which Al Guinness, unfortunately, is no longer around to tell us whether this is true or not. But what George explained to Guinness, by his reckoning, was that there was nothing for Obi-Wan to do for the last third of the movie. He was just kind of standing around while other people did things. And that wasn't powerful. It didn't make sense for the character. And the new thing that he had in mind of Obi-Wan sacrificing himself against Vader was a much better place to take that character and to take the story. Which, I think if you look at that, Lucas was right. So that's a very long-winded way of saying, certainly listen to the original creators of the character, and certainly listen to actors who bring an enormous amount of hard work and wise judgment to their characters and help create them. But, it's not the be-all and end-all of stuff. It goes back to being loyal to the story and seeing, what's the best role for characters in that.
For those of us who paid attention, we also know that Mark Hamill came around. He congratulated, Rian Johnson on the character, on the movie. He said, thankfully, he joked about it, thank God he didn't listen to me. We ended up with a wonderful movie that I may have intellectual differences with. In my humble opinion, Rian Johnson made the boldest stroke in challenging the status quo. And instead of asking how George would have done it, the only sensible way to bring a legacy character whose arc is truly resolved. Skywalker saga truly ends as episode 6. How do you pull him out of retirement? What do? You got to throw him in the fire again. You got to give him a new challenge. What does Luke never truly confront? Yes, he faces some fear in Return of the Jedi, but here his entire world is swept under from him, and he's entirely emotionally crushed. And it's that inner battle, because we've seen the badass Luke before off screen. The way that he's presented, Luke the Legend. We see him in the expanded universe in Legends novels. He's the ultimate ass kicker. What's the different way of showing it? What's the different thing you could do with him? And to me, that was the most right answer. And I would tend to agree with you that, sometimes the actor is not the best representation of the character. If we may move to, if you have something else to add to that, please, then we'll move to the moving target.
Well, Last Jedi, I think, is a really interesting story to take apart. And, having written the novelization, it's obviously, I've had a fair amount of experience digging into it. But, the one thing I'll just say in Last Jedi, in hopes that, maybe somebody who's on the fence about that story or doesn't like it might hear it and think differently, or not, that's okay, is, I think that when I first read The Last Jedi script, actually, I didn't immediately love it myself. I needed a fair amount of time to kind of sit with it and think about it. When the movie came out and reactions were, what they were in some quarters, I reminded myself of having felt that way and said, people need some time to sit with this story, and that's okay. That's actually a hallmark of a really interesting story. And I was actually very happy. That was the first novelization that didn't come out right with the movie, but came out essentially with the DVD release, which actually turned out to be terrific because it was about the right time for people to kind of reassess that. But the thing for Last Jedi, where I think it broke down for some people, but I think they could think about a little differently, is, a lot of people saw that as kind of a deconstruction of a
Mm-hmm.
heroic story, of throwing away
Mm-hmm.
a heroic story. But I think that is what we're set up to wrestle with. But what I think those people ought to think about is that's not how that story ends. Last Jedi winds up actually reaffirming heroic stories. I mean, Luke says scornfully to Rey, what did you think? I was going to go out with a laser sword and face down the entire First Order? And in the end of Last Jedi, that's exactly what he does. So it's really a reaffirmation following the questioning and the deconstruction. It's really a reaffirmation of heroic journeys, et cetera. And that's what makes it really work for me. It's for Luke and for everyone else, it's this hard-fought journey that winds up in a place where we're really channeling some classic Star Wars themes. So I'll just put that out there in case somebody hears it, maybe thinks, I'll watch that again. And, maybe there's something to that.
Jason, it's sort of a dream come true to fanboy about The Last Jedi with a Star Wars author. Even for me, it's not the perfect movie by any means. I still find a couple of things problematic, but I find that some stories kind of have to simmer for certain people, and they have to like cook the dish, and then it's ready after a while. For other people, it's an instantaneous, spontaneous reaction. When I saw it in theaters, to this day, to be honest with you, since Return of the Jedi, it's the only Star Wars movie to make me feel like a 6-year-old kid back in the 80s because of Luke's journey. Not the problematic stuff around it, but because of Luke. Guys, but you also co-wrote Star Wars: The Moving Target with Cecil Castellucci. If I may, a little bit short on time, guys. We don't have like 10 hours to do this. If I can deconstruct the story just a little bit, sorry if I butchered it along the way. It is basically Leia is the U.S. president in Air Force One. She's jumping, she's jumping around places. She's strategizing, from place to place. We are moving into that territory we were preparing for the Return of the Jedi and that last final assault on the second Death Star. It is simple yet effective story. As a matter of fact, I defined all of these three books, The Moving Target, Smuggler's Run, Weapons of the Jedi, as chapters of one larger story that I would recommend to people, even though it's not marketed as trilogy. It's really, really interesting to read as a trilogy. So what's this whole idea all along? What makes Leia so valuable to the Alliance at this point? Why is she the president?
Yeah, the Moving Target was, I think what Cecil and I both responded to that was it's exploring Leia's incredible sense of duty and the incredible sacrifices she makes. And then letting us see her do that by putting her as kind of in charge of this mission with this very, divergent crew that she has to kind of keep pointed in the right direction. But also there's some things to wrestle with there. One is, there's that sense of duty, that sense of sacrifice, but at the same time, it's not where her heart wants to be. She really wants to go find Han and do something, that really she's come to see as for herself. And how does she square that with her duties to the Alliance? And, she has one of the favorite parts of writing that with Cecil was the long kind of argument she has with Mon Mothma about duty and family and what she owes to people. That was really, really fun to dig into. But the other part of it is that, Leia's mission is entirely a diversion. And it works, but, because it works, she also is bringing a lot of people who answer her call into deadly danger. And how does she do that? How does she square, what she owes those people who she in some senses has brought somewhere on false pretenses with the larger mission and why it's important and why those sacrifices had to be made, which is kind of, things that she's been struggling with in her own life, but now are outside of her, and she has to, make sense of them for other people. So, that I think for me and Cecil both was the fun of that book, but also the challenge of it and the responsibility is being true to a character that we both really love and has been immensely inspiring to the two of us. And then, but putting her in some hard situations and with some hard choices to make.
Yeah,
Loved writing that book.
It surprised me. To this day, it surprises me. Even like in the High Republic, some of the young reader books, man, they get emotionally dark. They really get in there. They don't shy away by things. Obviously, we can't have grotesque things, A, because it's Star Wars franchise, B, because it's for younger readers. But I was feeling it for a minute. It's like, oh man, this is really tough. And you actually sort of half explain my second question. Guys, for those of you who are not too familiar with Star Wars Legends, Mon Mothma, the lady that we see in one of the leaders of the rebellion, she becomes a grander part of the New Alliance. Once the Emperor falls, she becomes a more prominent figure. And there's a lot of dynamics and relationships that happen between her and Leia in Star Wars Legends books. I just wanted to quickly to ask you, if you can't go too much into it, that's fine. But was it fun just writing and playing around with these two characters? It's sort of like picking them off the shelf, where any kind of nods to the past, what was done in the Legends, and say, aha. Now I'm going to have these two characters, both are political figures, and I'm going to have them, and Mon Mothma really serving more of as a mother figure. Was that fun to write?
Yeah, absolutely. But also looking, it's really kind of letting the prequel trilogy echo, where and also the interim stuff. We didn't know that. Like, I'm fascinated to see Mon Mothma in Andor. I'm really excited about that.
Yeah.
Because that's exactly some of the stuff that I was trying to channel, but stories that hadn't been told. But yeah, Mon Mothma has sacrificed. She's living in hiding. She has sacrificed an enormous amount fighting the Empire and standing up. She's seen Bail Organa die, her very good friend, we see all the way back in the prequel trilogy, and Leia's mother. She's put a target on her own homeworld. It's right in there in Moving Target, the idea that the Empire's plan after the Death Star is to target Mon Cala and Chandrila and destroy them. Mon Mothma knows what Leia is going through. She has been through some of those same terrible choices, etc. And but she knows Leia pretty well and knows that Leia she's so self-directed, etc. But she can get kind of tunnel vision. Like, this is my duty. I'm doing it this way. And so what Mon Mothma is trying to do is trying to shake her out of it and essentially say, you are not the only one who's had to make these choices. And you should learn from someone else, which is that duty alone won't save you. You have to also do things for yourself. And she's trying to get her to see that. And the interesting thing about a book like that is that Moving Target is not the place for Leia to completely learn that lesson and then put the next part in in a practice. That really belongs to Return of the Jedi. But it's at least kind of trying to set that up so that you see the way the story moves into Return of the Jedi
and get a
satisfying payoff.
Yeah.
And then bring it all the way forward to the sequel trilogy, where we see her still wrestling with the exact same things, and try to reflect on that a little bit.
Yeah. I also enjoyed the contrast between the two novels, where, like you mentioned before, if Luke's story felt more like centered on that spiritual experience and growth, and it's a slower paced kind of story, this one is a pretty dense plot. There's a lot of stuff happening there, and it moves at a pretty brisk pace. Was it hard, like, putting all the stuff there, making it so dense? Because it's still a tiny book, compared to like adult novels. And you didn't lose any detail. All of the stuff is there. Like, was it hard just like cramming it all together?
Well, it gets back to what we were talking about earlier, like characters and plot, and kind of thinking, what is the story here? And I knew what the end game was there. The end game there is the showdown with the Imperials and the people she summoned arriving to help them, and then having to wrestle with that. How does that come out? And from there, you sort of work backwards and think, what are the lessons we want Leia to learn? What are the things we want her to wrestle with? How does that story play out in the interaction between her and the various characters too? And then, you kind of put those things together, and you have, kind of X number of incidents. And then you work backward, and it's kind of a travelogue. Okay, well, how many places do I need for that to tell that story effectively? As well as, just classic Star Wars things. Like, it's really fun, kind of Flash Gordon style, to visit 3 or 4 planets and see them and make sure they're very different and very compelling. That was a fun thing to do in Moving Target that was not available in Weapon of a Jedi, because again, that was going to be a different book, kind of quiet and set,
one
really
setting,
mostly in one place, etc. But that's okay. That's what that story called for.
Yeah. So I'm, even without asking the question, I'm gathering. I didn't get the whole Wikipedia on you and your prior experience with Star Wars, even as a fan, Star Wars Legends. But I'm sort of deducing that you're very well versed in Star Wars Legends, based on your interaction and writing for and being a fan of both Luke and Leia. It's the way I summarize both books, basically, the Weapons of the Jedi and the Moving Target. Would you say it's fair to say that Luke is the heart and Leia is the brains?
Oh, oh, I love that. They're kind of both heart to me, but Luke is the sort of, we're talking classic trilogy here. I mean, Luke is the sort of the open heart that, the open heart that needs to become more guarded, that has some shocks to learn, etc. And Leia is the heart where she will go through anything. She is so determined and so passionate and so dedicated that she will go through anything. But she has to kind of open up her heart to give something for herself. So, they're kind of moving in sort of opposite directions like that. Like, in a way, it's not unlike the sequel trilogy and, Rey and Finn and Rose, etc. And the idea of, what do you give to the cause versus what do you do for yourself? That's there with Luke and Leia a generation earlier, and what they face. But yeah, I mean, I like heart and brains, but I see them as, I don't know, for me, all characters are heart. I mean, that's, we're not, even the brainiest character's arc is going to be about what's in their heart and their emotional journey and where are they trying to get to, etc. So I don't know, maybe that reveals more about me as a writer and how I think about characters, but there we are.
Yeah, because when I was a kid watching those movies, as a child, especially like younger child, 7, 8, you never questioned boys versus girls, the gender roles and all that crazy stuff. You just follow characters and you see the strength of the character. It doesn't have to be masculinity to it. It could be just, the heart and soul and pushing forward. And I always found how in The New Hope, which is my favorite Star Wars movie, Luke is always the heart. He's like, I'm here to rescue. He's like, he's so clumsy about that movie. And Leia's like so practical. She's like, did you guys find an exit here? Let me just blow a hole through this wall. She is the brain. She's sharp, but you also said, she also has that tunnel vision. But it's a really, really fun book to read. Any last thoughts on this? And at the end, guys, I wanted to do something different from this interview. Just throw 4 very quick questions with just literally 1-sentence answers, if you could. But any last thoughts on Leia, the Moving Target?
Once again, it was such a privilege to get to write that character. I feel very lucky. You just alluded to this, but I was 8 years old, and Leia Organa became one of my heroes, and we see her as, essentially the leader of that rebel cell, and and she's telling her would-be rescuers what to do, etc. And that made a huge impression on me, and I think in a way also it kind of made me a better person. It was a great lesson to learn as an 8-year-old boy, and not the obvious lesson in 1977 USA either. But to put it very simply, the girl was the boss, and I thought that was great because I loved that character. And it went hand in hand with me also, loving Sigourney Weaver's Ripley, the same thing. So, I think that my love for those two movie characters gave me, at a really important time as not a man, a boy, really kept me out of a lot of kind of toxic dude nonsense about women and their place and what they can do. I mean, girl bosses, to use that sort of terrible modern expression, but it's a useful one. I mean, we're two of my earliest heroes, and I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah. If I were to think of a yin and yang, you have in all the classical folklore and mythology, you have the female beginning, Mother Gaia, and you have Kronos, the father Sky. And it's the yin and yang always interacting. I personally always enjoy the female leads who represent the feminine strengths and that fierceness of a mother, like Sigourney Weaver plays in Aliens 2, and projecting that instead of just trying to slide into the man's shoes and trying to one-up the guy. Sarah Connor and Ripley are some of the baddest chicks in cinema, and they don't have to be guys. They don't have to put like 200 pounds, look like gorillas to kick ass. That's who they are as people. Ripley's fight is for literally her adopted daughter, for the little girl. Jason, before I quickly throw the last questions at you, thank you so much for your time. I had tons of pleasure talking to you. I love your books, and I'll keep recommending them to all the fans because I genuinely enjoyed it. You delighted me. Like this is what I live for. Star Wars lives in the books for me, not the movies, not the games. It's the books, and those two were just on the point, man. Very quick questions, 1-sentence answers. The most divisive Star Wars question: who restores the balance in the Force, Luke or Anakin?
You need both of them, which is a very Star Wars lesson. You can't do it on your own.
Okay.
You need more than one person.
You sort of cheated. Okay. I was looking for one day. I was like, please say Luke. Please say Luke. Who is a better mentor, Yoda in Empire Strikes Back or Luke in The Last Jedi?
Wow, that's a really good question. I'm going to go with Yoda, which is probably just because I was 11 years old and that movie meant the world to me. But Yoda, Luke is teaching some important lessons in Last Jedi, but they build on lessons you need to learn from a Yoda figure earlier.
Yeah. I mean, because today everyone is a professional critic, and everybody takes apart that Rey and Luke training session on Acto. I thought it was some of the most brilliant stuff in Star Wars. I really, really loved it. They literally have same on-screen time training as Luke did on Dagobah. Both were great for me. Is Leia as strong in the Force as Luke Skywalker?
She probably has the same amount of potential, but it manifests itself in a very different way. And I think a wonderful story that's started being told in various places that I want to see a lot more of is, Leia, whether she's conscious of it or not, how has she used the Force in her illustrious career before she ever learns of her parentage, etc.
Mm-hmm. And the last one is more of a kind of a existential philosophical question that I don't think gets asked enough. If you're a droid walking into a cantina on Tatooine and you're not being served, do you have enough sentience to feel offended?
I think you certainly feel offended and excluded and everything else. On the other hand, I will say that the C-3PO presumably can't get intoxicated, and after looking in the Mos Eisley cantina, I think you probably got off lucky. It's not really a place you want to be, particularly if you're quickly not using your best judgment. So yeah, C-3PO should be offended, and we should be on his side. But I think he actually got lucky getting out of there.
As a kid, for some reason, obviously most kids enjoy robots. and that's what those droids are, robots. For some reason, they never translated as robots. They were always alive. You know, C-3PO and R2-D2, both of them felt alive. Well, guys, there you had it. Mr. Jason Fry and his awesome Star Wars books. Once again, Jason, thank you so much. Guys, thanks for watching. Please go ahead and follow Jason. I'll drop all of his relevant links in this video description below. I'll embed it in the video as well. Go out there, find your perfect Star Wars story, enjoy Legends, enjoy canon. I think it's fair to say that has been the mantra of the day for today, and just focus on the things that you like. Jason, thank you so much. Guys, thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you next time. Take care, everyone.